My name is Mark Callahan, and at 35 years old I find myself standing before the massive wrought iron gates of my grandfather's estate. My hand slid into the pocket of my old jacket, the worn-out fabric of familiar comfort after a decade of use. A June wind rustled through the giant oaks lining the drive here in Arden, North Carolina, carrying the distinct smell of pine needles and old ghosts. I drew in a long, shaky breath, trying to calm the familiar unease. Down the drive, my beat-up 2005 Ford pickup, its silver paint flaking away, looked like a stray dog in a pack of wolves. It was parked alone, separated from a row of polished Mercedes and BMWs baking in the afternoon sun next to a brand-new glossy Tesla that had my brother Ben's name written all over it. The annual Callahan family conference was set to start, and the gut punch of not belonging here among my own family was already settling in. This place, this mansion, was more than just a home. It was the monument Samuel Callahan, my grandfather, had built to his own relentless ambition. The gray stone walls were thick with moss, and the terracotta roof tiles had faded to a dusty red. Sunlight caught the stained glass panes, making them glitter with the silent history of the Callahan timber and construction empire, a legacy that had made our name synonymous with power since the 1950s. But the warm, welcoming home my grandfather had envisioned was long gone. Now these rooms served as a gladiator pit, a theater where my relatives paraded their latest acquisitions and stock market wins. Every conversation was a performance, laced with subtle, cutting remarks designed to remind me of my place as the family's designated charity case. My knuckles went white as I clutched the handle of my new leather briefcase. It felt foreign and stiff in my hand, the only polished item I owned, a stark contrast to my simple light blue button-down, worn-out jeans and scuffed-up work boots. It was my armor. Tucked inside were the papers I had guarded for 3 long years. The tangible proof that the man they all wrote off as a failure had built something of his own. I was finally ready to shatter their perception of me, especially the one held by my father, Robert Callahan. My heart wasn't hammering against my ribs from fear, though. It was pounding with a hot, familiar rage, a fire fueled by the accumulated pain of every sneer and condescending word I had ever endured within these walls. The familiar fire of that anger, stoked by years of humiliation in this very house, was cut short by a voice from the porch. "Mark, cutting it a little close, aren't we?" The words sliced through my thoughts. It was my older brother, Ben. He was leaning against one of the grand porch columns, swirling a glass of dark red wine. His posture was pure arrogance, amplified by a perfectly tailored gray suit that fit his tall frame like a second skin. He was our father's clone, right down to the cold, assessing eyes and the condescending curl of his lip. He gestured with his glass toward my truck. "Seriously? That old rust bucket is still on the road? I can only imagine what you pour into it just to keep it from falling apart." I forced a thin, tight smile as I walked past him through the open gate. A muscle in my jaw jumped, but I kept my voice steady. "It gets me where I need to go, Ben. That's all that matters." The words felt like stones in my mouth. Everything in me wanted to scream that this truck was the only thing that didn't abandon me when I was building my company from scrap, sleeping in the cab because I couldn't afford rent. It was my office, my home, my witness when every last one of them, especially him, wrote me off for dead. Stepping inside the mansion was like hitting a wall of sound and scent. The air, heavy with competing expensive perfumes, was filled with the braying laughter of my relatives. This was no warm family get-together. The Callahan family conference was a completely different breed of animal. This annual event was supposed to be a place where cousins, aunts, and uncles, relatives I laid eyes on only once a year, came together to lift each other up. That, at least, had been my grandfather's dream. Samuel had started this conference back in the 1980s, envisioning a place where generations of Callahans would forge bonds, share resources, and create a unified legacy. But that vision died with him in 2005. The moment my father, Robert Callahan, took over as the family patriarch, the conference twisted into something else entirely. He transformed it into a platform for bragging rights, a place where your net worth was the only measure of your value. As I entered the grand living room, the light from a massive crystal chandelier cast a cold glow on the expensively dressed figures gathered there. My cousin Chloe poured into a tight red dress with a diamond necklace that glittered obnoxiously, was loudly recounting her recent trip to the Maldives. Across the room, Uncle Arthur, who ran a string of boutique hotels in Charlotte, held court, boasting about the new yacht he'd just bought. And at the head of the long walnut table, my father sat like a king on his throne. His gaze was as sharp and unforgiving as a razor's edge as he scanned a thick stack of documents. Someone's portfolio, no doubt, being weighed and judged. Here, voting rights were directly tied to your declared wealth. My father, controlling a staggering 40% of the vote, held absolute power. My own share, based on the meager assets they believed I possessed, was a pathetic 3%. It was just enough to earn me a seat at the table, a courtesy invitation, but not nearly enough to make anyone actually hear what I had to say. "Mark, sit," my father commanded without looking up from his papers. His voice was low, but it cut through the chatter like ice. "Still wearing that old thing? How many times have I told you to dress like a Callahan?" The room went quiet for a beat, just long enough for me to hear a few muffled snickers. I could feel their eyes on me, their smug, pitying smiles. It was a familiar heat that crawled up the back of my neck. I pulled out a heavy chair, the wood scraping against the polished floor, and sat. I placed the briefcase squarely on my lap, my fingers tracing the smooth, unfamiliar texture of the leather. "I think the shirt's fine, Dad," I said, keeping my voice quiet but refusing to let it waver. "It's comfortable." He let out a short, derisive snort and shook his head in disgust. "Comfort doesn't buy you a voice in this room, Mark. You, of all people, should know the rules by now." He rapped his knuckles on the table, his gaze sweeping across the room as if he were a king inspecting his subjects. "Today's primary topic is the sale of this estate." A murmur rippled through the room. "I have received a very generous offer from a development corporation. They want to build a luxury resort on the property. The price is exceptional." The words landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Sell the mansion. This house was the heart of my grandfather's life's work. The place where he'd poured his soul into every stone. It was the backdrop to every good memory I had. Chasing fireflies in the garden on long summer evenings, listening to his stories about starting out with nothing but a tiny second-hand sawmill. I wanted to scream, to object, but I knew my 3% meant nothing. My voice would be swallowed by the silence. "Robert, are you certain this is the right move?" A deep, steady voice spoke up from the far end of the table. It was Uncle George, my father's youngest brother, and the only one who ever had the courage to question him directly. He sat there in a simple button-down, his salt and pepper hair and gentle expression a stark contrast to everyone else. "This house is Dad's legacy. Do you really believe he would want us to sell it off?" My father's eyes narrowed into slits, his cold stare locking onto Uncle George. "George, don't be so sentimental," my father snapped back. "This is a business decision, not a trip down memory lane. With the capital from this sale, we can fund far more significant ventures. Your 9% vote isn't going to stop this." Uncle George pressed his lips into a thin, tight line, but he held his tongue. I caught his eye for a moment and saw a flicker of understanding there, a shared frustration. He was the only one aside from my late mother who had ever offered a word of encouragement when I walked away from the family timber business to chase my own dream in biotechnology. But not even he knew what I was carrying in this briefcase. The meeting officially commenced and I fell into my usual role, the silent observer. I listened as my relatives took turns preening. Chloe droned on about her latest investment in some flashy Silicon Valley startup. Ben boasted about the new penthouse he'd just closed on in Miami Beach. Each word, each self-satisfied smile felt like another twist of the knife, a sharp reminder of the years they had all dismissed me. "Mark, are you still messing around with that little food company of yours?" Chloe asked, her voice syrupy sweet but laced with venom. "I hear those little passion projects tend to burn out pretty quickly." I managed a tight smile and a nod. "It's doing just fine, Chloe. Thanks for your concern." Inside, though, a clock was ticking. I was counting down the hours. In 2 days, at the final meeting of this conference, I would finally lay my cards on the table. I would show them all that my little food company, the sustainable food startup they all sneered at, had just been valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. I would reveal that I, Mark Callahan, the family reject, now controlled assets worth $95 million, giving me a 40% voting share equal to my father's. And I would use every ounce of that power to save my grandfather's home. Later that night, I lay awake in the old bed in my small second-floor guest room, listening to the rhythmic chirping of crickets outside in the garden. The briefcase sat on the floor beside me, a silent, heavy promise of what was to come. My thoughts drifted to my mother, who had been my fiercest defender, and to my grandfather, who had taught me that a person's real worth had nothing to do with their bank balance. It was about the integrity of your life and the legacy you built for others. I closed my eyes, a fresh wave of cold anger and fierce determination washing over me. In 2 days, this family was finally going to learn who Mark Callahan truly was. The first pale light of morning was just starting to seep through the thin curtains of my little room when I opened my eyes. Outside, birds had begun their day, and their bright, cheerful calls carried me back to summer mornings from my childhood. I could almost feel the cool, damp grass under my bare feet again, my small hands tight around the string of a clumsy homemade kite, with my grandfather Samuel walking right beside me, his voice a low, steady rumble of encouragement. This house wasn't always a battleground for egos and resentment. It used to be a sanctuary, a place filled with an uncomplicated sense of love and belonging, where my grandfather's simple lessons about integrity and character took root in my soul. But as I swung my legs over the side of the bed this morning, the illusion shattered. I slipped on my worn-out boots and my gaze landed on the stark leather briefcase sitting on the table. In its shadow, those warm memories felt like ghosts, a distant fading light from a world that no longer existed within this family. I made my way down the main wooden staircase, and every groan of the old floorboards under my weight seemed to whisper a piece of the Callahan saga. It's a story I know intimately, not just because its blood runs in my veins, but because its slow, painful corruption has been the very thing that fueled my solitary drive to forge a different legacy. There was a time when the Callahan name wasn't synonymous with luxury cars, bloated stock portfolios, and the cutthroat scramble for voting rights. We were once laborers and visionaries who had nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn refusal to quit. It all started with him, with my grandfather, Samuel Callahan. I took a seat at the breakfast table in the large, airy kitchen. The rich smell of coffee hung in the air, mingling with the soft rustle of the newspaper Uncle George was reading. It was just the two of us. The rest of them, predictably, were still asleep in their beds or would take their breakfast in the formal dining room. A place of silk tablecloths and gleaming silver they felt was more suitable. Uncle George glanced up from his paper, a kind, knowing smile on his face. His eyes seemed to ask the question he wouldn't speak aloud. You holding up, Mark? I gave a short nod and reached for a slice of toast, but my thoughts were already a world away, caught in the story of the man who started everything. Grandpa Samuel was born in 1925, the son of a poor farming family on the rural edges of Arden, North Carolina. In those days, Arden was just a sleepy little town where your options were either tilling the soil or working at one of the local sawmills. My grandfather started with nothing but the raw power in his arms and a mind that never stopped turning. At 18, he signed up to fight in World War II. He came back home in 1945 carrying not just the physical scars of combat, but a new, unshakable determination to build a life of security and meaning for the family he hoped to have one day. He started with one small sawmill, purchased with a modest bank loan and every last penny he had managed to save from working odd jobs. "Nobody thought I had a chance, Mark," he told me once, his eyes shining with the memory of those grueling early years. "They all said I was a fool, a country kid who thought he could play with the big dogs down in Charlotte. But I wasn't trying to get rich, I was trying to build something that would last. Something for my children and their children after them." And he did. Callahan Lumber grew at an incredible rate. He wasn't content to just sell timber, he was an innovator. He developed new types of building materials like specialized fire-resistant plywood and treated lumber that could endure North Carolina's punishing humidity. By the 1950s, Callahan Lumber was a trusted name all across the American South. But he didn't stop there. He began investing in land, buying up huge tracts of forest to guarantee his timber supply, and he built state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities. By the time I came along in 1990, the Callahan family name represented an empire, with this very mansion, which Grandpa designed himself, standing as the grand symbol of all he had accomplished. But the things I admired most about my grandfather had nothing to do with his money or his influence. It was his character. He still wore simple flannel shirts and drove a beat-up old pickup. He spent his weekends in the woodworking shed behind the house, patiently teaching me how to build tables and chairs from scratch. "Money is just a tool, Mark," he would tell me, his voice always calm and certain. "It can help you put a roof over your head and food on the table, but the second you let it become who you are, you've lost the most important part of yourself." He was convinced that family was the bedrock of everything, that real riches were measured by the love and respect we showed one another. The idea for the family conference first came to him in 1980. He saw that his empire was expanding, and his children and grandchildren were starting to drift apart, each pursuing their own lives. He wanted to do something to keep them connected. He had 4 children, my father, Robert, the eldest, my aunt, Elizabeth, an interior designer based in Charleston, my uncle, Arthur, who owned the hotel chain, and the youngest, Uncle George, a humble civil engineer living in Raleigh. Grandpa worried that their individual successes would eventually tear the family apart, so he created the Callahan Family Conference. It was meant to be an annual retreat where everyone would gather to talk about their lives, share their challenges, and offer each other support. I can still recall the first few conferences I attended as a boy. I would sit on the floor by Grandpa's chair just listening to him and my grandmother talk with my aunts and uncles. In those days, the meetings weren't about voting power or investment returns. They were about big, boisterous family dinners, with my grandmother's famous mashed potatoes and barbecue ribs. My aunts and uncles would talk openly about their hardships, like the time Uncle Arthur almost went under after a hotel project fell through, or when Aunt Elizabeth needed seed money to launch her design firm. My grandfather would just listen patiently, offering quiet wisdom and more often than not a discreet loan or a crucial introduction to help them get back on their feet. "We are a family," he would always say. "If one of us stumbles, it's the job of the rest of us to help them back up." I cherished those times. I loved the way my grandfather looked at every single person with the same level of respect, whether they were thriving or struggling. I loved when he'd call me out to the garden, put his hand on my shoulder, and point to the towering oak trees he'd planted the year my father was born. "One day, Mark," he'd say, "it will be your turn to carry these values forward." I believed him with my whole heart. But then, in 2005, he was gone. A sudden heart attack took him from us, right as I was turning 15. And the moment he died, his dream of a truly united family started to crumble. My father, Robert, stepped into his shoes as the head of the conference. As the oldest son, he'd always felt the immense weight of his father's legacy on his shoulders, but he chose to honor that legacy in his own way, a way I am certain my grandfather would never have sanctioned. My dad is a hard, inflexible man who believes that money is the only real scorecard for a person's life. He runs Callahan Lumber with an iron will, transforming it from a regional power into a global corporation. But in his relentless pursuit of profit, he has twisted the family conference into something my grandfather would no longer recognize. I will never forget the first conference after Grandpa died in 2006. I was 16, still raw with grief, but I was looking forward to being with my family again. I expected it to be like it always was, full of stories and hugs and a sense of shared strength. Instead, I walked in to find my father standing at the head of the table holding a massive ledger. He announced that from that point forward, everyone would be required to formally declare their personal assets. Voting rights in the conference, he declared, would now be allocated based on wealth, to better reflect each member's contribution to the family's prosperity. I was just a kid. I didn't fully grasp the implications. I just knew something was deeply wrong. I felt my mother, who was always my rock, squeeze my hand tightly under the table. When I looked at her, I saw her eyes were filled with a profound and helpless worry. My father's new rule poisoned everything. The warm, open conversations of the past were replaced by slick presentations on stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and profit margins. The ones with the most money, like my father with his 40% share, or Uncle Arthur with his 15, became the new royalty. And people like my mother, who had dedicated her life to raising a family, or Uncle George, who chose a life of quiet service over wealth, were suddenly silenced and pushed to the fringes. And me, a 16-year-old kid with nothing to my name, was granted a single symbolic 1%. It was a number designed to make me feel completely insignificant. But the deepest cut was the way my own father treated me. He would criticize me openly right there in front of everyone, calling me lazy and unfocused, telling me I wasn't worthy of the Callahan name. "Mark, if you don't stop wasting your life with these foolish fantasies, you will have no place in this family," he would say, his voice devoid of any warmth. I wanted to scream back at him that I wasn't wasting my life, that I had my own dreams, that I wanted to build something that mattered just like Grandpa had. But I bit my tongue. I kept my silence because back then I didn't have the proof to back up my words. The memory brought a bitter taste to my mouth. I took a sip of my coffee, the heat doing nothing to soothe the burn in my throat. Uncle George folded his newspaper and set it on the table, his kind eyes studying my face. "What's weighing on you, Mark?" he asked, his voice soft. I managed a weak smile and shook my head. "Just thinking about Grandpa," I said. "I was just wondering what he would think if he could see what this conference has become." Uncle George let out a long, heavy sigh, his gaze turning inward. "He'd be heartbroken, Mark. Absolutely heartbroken, but he would be so proud of you. You're more like him than anyone else in this house knows." His words were a gut punch, a painful mix of comfort and sorrow. My mind flashed back to all the times I'd sat alone in this very kitchen after a conference, my face hot with shame after Ben had mocked me, Chloe had sneered at me, and my own father had looked at me with nothing but cold disappointment. I thought of my mother, how she would hold me and whisper that I had nothing to prove to any of them. And then I thought of the briefcase sitting upstairs guarding the secret I'd carried for so long. My sustainable food company, built from the ground up with sweat and borrowed money, was now worth hundreds of millions. This wasn't just about saving my grandfather's house anymore. It was about taking back my own voice. It was about proving to my father, to Ben, and to this entire clan of vipers that a man's worth can't be measured by the number on his bank statement. The second day of the conference was about to start. I knew my father would be relentless, pushing his agenda to sell the estate. I also knew that for now, with my paltry 3%, there was nothing I could do to stop him. Not yet. But I had a plan. I'd already been in contact with my lawyer. The documents were all prepared. On the final day, I would drop the bombshell. I would show them all that Mark Callahan was not the loser they had all decided he was. And I would use everything I had to protect what my grandfather built. I stood up, still holding my coffee mug, and walked over to the kitchen window. I looked out at the garden where the massive oak trees my grandfather had planted stood tall and unyielding after all these years. "Grandpa," I whispered to the empty air, "I'm not going to let you down." Uncle George came up behind me and put a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Ready for round 2, Mark?" "Ready isn't the word I'd use, Uncle George," I answered, turning and sinking into one of the wooden chairs at the table. "But I'll survive. I always do." He nodded, his eyes filled with that familiar quiet sympathy. "Just hold your ground. Robert can be a bulldozer, but he isn't the only voice that matters." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But as I walked into the main conference room and saw the huge projection screen my father had set up, flanked by a towering stack of papers, a familiar knot of dread tightened in my chest. My father was already seated at the head of the table, a king on his throne, dressed in a severe navy suit that matched the coldness of his stare. My brother Ben was at his right hand, his thumbs flying across his phone screen. He was probably texting his friends, gloating about that new Miami penthouse. Across from me, my cousin Chloe watched me enter, the corners of her red lipsticked mouth pulling into a familiar condescending smirk. The others were all there: Uncle Arthur, Aunt Elizabeth, a handful of more distant relatives. But none of them met my eyes for more than a fleeting second. I was an expert at being invisible in this room. "Sit down, Mark," my father's voice cut through the silence, low but sharp enough to draw blood. "We have a packed agenda, and I have no intention of wasting time." I pulled out a chair, setting my briefcase carefully on my lap. I fought to keep my expression neutral, to give him nothing. Inside, though, I was steeling myself for the inevitable assault. The second day of the conference was always when my father unveiled his grandest schemes: new corporate ventures, aggressive investment strategies, or, like this year, his plan to bulldoze my grandfather's home to make way for a soulless resort. I had heard him float the idea yesterday, but today he would lay out the specifics. I knew I couldn't just sit here and let it happen. The meeting began. My father stood, rapping his pen lightly on the table to command the room's full attention. "Today we will have a serious discussion about the future of this property," he announced, his voice booming with authority. "The Riverside Development Corporation has made us a very generous offer: $25 million for the land, plus a stake in the luxury resort they intend to build here." He paused for effect. "This is a chance for the Callahan family to grow our influence, to evolve my father's legacy into something more modern, more lucrative." A few of my relatives offered scattered, tentative applause. Ben nodded eagerly, a smug grin plastered on his face. "It's a brilliant move, Dad. A resort of that caliber will only enhance our family's brand. I've seen the preliminary designs. It's going to be a world-class destination for the global elite. A hot rush of blood roared in my ears. Sell the mansion? Erase my grandfather's home, a place saturated with memories, and replace it with a playground for rich tourists? Every muscle in my body tensed. I wanted to leap to my feet and scream, but I forced myself to stay put. I had to wait for the right moment. For now, my objections would be nothing more than air, dissipating before they even registered. I shot a look at Uncle George. He was frowning deeply, his knuckles white as he gripped his teacup. "Robert, don't you think we should be more cautious here?" Uncle George's voice was quiet, but it carried a firm edge. "This estate isn't just a piece of real estate. It's the heart of this family. Dad built this place so we would always have a home to come back to, not so we could sell it to the highest bidder." My father let out a dismissive snort, his eyes flashing with annoyance. "George, you're hopelessly sentimental. This is a business transaction, not a bedtime story. Your 9% isn't going to stop progress." Chloe let out a high-pitched, artificial giggle. "Uncle George, I understand you're attached to this old house, but we have to be practical. Nobody lives in the past anymore." She shot a pointed, venomous look in my direction. "Well, except for Mark, maybe?" The room broke into a chorus of cruel laughter. Ben clapped his hands together, his grin widening as he looked at me. "She's got a point, Mark. You're still trying to live like it's Grandpa's time, aren't you? Driving that old clunker and wearing that shirt from the 90s? My grip on the briefcase tightened until my fingers ached. I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly. "I live the way I see fit, Ben," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Not everyone needs a Tesla to validate their existence." The room went silent for a beat. Then Ben threw his head back and laughed, a loud, ugly sound. "Oh, listen to him. Still so bitter about being broke, Mark? Maybe if you sold off that sad little company of yours, you could finally afford a decent suit." His words were a direct hit, a deliberate jab at my deepest insecurities. I felt the heat rise in my face, a burning wave of shame and anger. But I refused to give him the satisfaction of a response. I stayed silent, not because I was defeated, but because I knew my time hadn't come yet. Tomorrow, when I laid my $95 million valuation on the table, giving me a 40% voting share that would match my father's, Ben wouldn't be laughing. My father slammed his hand on the table, the sharp crack cutting through the tension. "That's enough, Mark. If you have nothing of substance to add, then be quiet and listen. We are discussing serious business here." I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, the sting of his dismissal as sharp as a slap. Suddenly, a memory from a conference 5 years earlier flooded my mind, as raw and painful as if it had happened yesterday. It was 2020, I was 30 years old and 3 years into building my sustainable food company. The business was finally gaining traction, but I was still living on next to nothing, pouring every dollar I had back into research and development. That year, the family timber business, Callahan Lumber, was struggling. The construction materials market was wildly unpredictable, and the company was feeling the pressure. My father, as chairman, proposed a high-stakes gamble. He wanted to take out a massive loan to build a new lumber processing plant in South America. The labor was cheap, yes, but the political climate was dangerously unstable. I had pored over his proposal for weeks. I read every industry report I could find, analyzed the market trends, and came to a terrifying conclusion. My father's plan was a house of cards. If the market took another downturn, the debt he wanted to take on could easily bankrupt the entire company. On the second day of the conference, I did something I had never done before. I stood up and dared to challenge him in front of the entire family. "Dad," I began, my voice shaking but firm, "I think this is far too risky." I could feel every eye in the room on me. If we sink all this capital into South America and the market turns against us, the company could be wiped out. We should be investing that money and upgrading the technology at our domestic plants instead." The room fell dead silent, but it wasn't a silence of consideration. It was a silence of shock and disbelief. They were all staring at me like I had just grown a second head. Ben was the first to break the silence, letting out a loud, barking laugh. "Mark, what in the hell do you know about running a global business? You can barely keep the lights on at that little science project of yours," Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Exactly how many votes do you even have? 2%? 3? You should probably just sit down, Mark." But I didn't sit down. I held my ground and looked directly at my father, praying he would see the logic in what I was saying. "Dad, please. I've done the research. I know what I'm talking about. This is a gamble we can't afford to take." My father rose slowly from his chair, his eyes blazing with fury. "Mark, you are wasting everyone's time. Sting, you do not have the voting power to have a voice in this discussion. If you don't sit down and keep quiet, you can leave." I tried to argue to make him understand, but he cut me off. "Enough!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger toward the door. "Get out, Mark. You don't belong in this room." I just stood there, paralyzed, my world imploding. My eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for a single sign of support, but all I found were sneering grins and cold, empty stares. Even Uncle George, my only ally, just lowered his head, defeated. I turned and walked out of that room, my body heavy with a humiliation so profound it left no room for words. That night I drove back to Raleigh, swearing to myself that I would never set foot in that house again. But the following year I learned through the grapevine that Callahan Lumber had taken a catastrophic hit, losing millions on the failed South American venture. The new plant had been seized during a period of intense political turmoil, and the company had been forced to sell off major assets just to cover the debt. No one ever called to apologize. No one ever acknowledged that I had been right all along. At a later meeting, my father simply stated that mistakes are part of the learning process, and then moved on as if nothing had happened. But I hadn't forgotten. I never would. That scar is still there, and every time I walk into this room, it throbs with a phantom pain. The memory of that day in 2020 makes my grip on my briefcase tighten. And now, as my father drones on about his grand vision for the resort, I can feel that same old rage beginning to boil just beneath the surface. "I propose we hold a preliminary vote today," he announced, his voice leaving no room for debate. "All in favor of selling the property, please raise your hand." Instantly, hands shot up around the table: Ben, Chloe, Uncle Arthur, and a few of the others. Uncle George just shook his head slowly, his own hands remaining firmly on the table. I didn't raise my hand either, but I knew it was a pointless gesture. With my 3%, I was a ghost. "Mark, still in opposition?" my father asked, his eyes like chips of ice. "Do you have a coherent argument this time, or are you just here to waste our oxygen again?" I took a slow, deliberate breath and met his gaze head on. "Dad, this house is Grandpa's soul. If we sell it, we're not just liquidating an asset. We're selling off the very idea of what this family is supposed to be." Ben let out a loud, theatrical groan. "Oh, give me a break. Spare us the sermon, Mark." "Ben!" I shot back, my voice low but sharp. "Not everything in this world has a price tag. Grandpa built this home so we would have a place to gather, not so we could slap a price on it and sell it off like a piece of inventory." My father slammed his hand on the table again, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "Mark, that is enough. You have no standing here. If you can't accept the decision, then sit there in silence and let the adults handle things." His words struck me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I wanted to stand up right then and there, I wanted to scream, to shove my $95 million valuation in all their smug faces. But I held my tongue. My plan was set for the final day, and I had to see it through. I risked a glance at Uncle George, and he gave me a barely perceptible nod, a silent message. "Hold on, Mark. Your time is coming." After the meeting broke, I went straight to the garden and found a quiet bench under one of the old oak trees. A few moments later, Uncle George followed and sat down beside me. "You all right?" he asked gently. "I'm just tired, Uncle George," I admitted, my voice rough with exhaustion. "I'm so tired of being the family joke, of being treated like I'm nothing." I looked up at the massive, sprawling branches above us, but I'm not going to let them win. He put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Just stay the course. Wait for your moment." He paused, then looked at me intently. "You have a plan, don't you?" I looked back at him, hesitating for only a second. I had to trust someone. "I have $95 million in personal assets," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My startup, it's a lot more successful than any of them could ever imagine. Tomorrow, at the final vote, I'm going to announce it. I'll have enough voting power to veto the sale." Uncle George's eyes widened in disbelief, and then he threw his head back and let out a booming, heartfelt laugh that echoed through the quiet garden. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "You really are Samuel Callahan's grandson. Robert is not going to know what hit him." We sat there for a long time, talking about my grandfather, about the values he stood for, about everything this family had lost. As we talked, I felt a heavy weight begin to lift from my shoulders, as if I had finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for years. Tomorrow I would face them all. I would face my father. I would face the man I used to be and finally step into the one I had become. I would take back my voice, and I would save my grandfather's home. Later that night, I lay in the old bed in my small guest room. Moonlight streamed through the thin curtains, casting a silvery glow on the leather briefcase that sat on the table waiting. The sound of crickets chirping in the garden outside my window should have been soothing, but sleep was impossible. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm driven not by fear, but by a potent cocktail of adrenaline and rage. All the years of being dismissed, ridiculed, and shoved into the shadows, it was all coming to an end. Tomorrow, I was ready. My lawyer, Elizabeth, had sent a final confirmation email late last night. Attached were the official documents, the irrefutable proof of my assets. $95 million. All of it earned from the sustainable food company I had poured my blood, sweat, and soul into building from nothing. By my calculations, that valuation would give me a 41% share of the family vote. It was enough. It was enough to challenge any decision made by my father, Robert Callahan, the man who had always wielded his power like a weapon, certain that he alone controlled our family's destiny. My thoughts drifted to my mother. She had always been my champion, my unwavering believer, but she wasn't here to see this. Cancer had taken her from us 3 years ago, leaving a gaping hole in my life that would never heal. But her words, her lessons were etched into my heart. She was the one who taught me that a person's true worth isn't measured by the world's applause, but by the integrity of their actions when no one is watching. "Mark," she'd said to me once, her hand holding mine as I wrestled with the early brutal days of my startup, "you are my shining star. Don't you ever let anyone convince you otherwise." Her voice echoed in my mind now, a steady flame burning away the last of my doubts. I also thought of Uncle George, the only person in this family who had ever truly seen me. Tonight, sitting together under the old oak, he'd shared stories about how Grandpa himself had been ridiculed when he was starting out, dismissed as a backwoods dreamer for having the audacity to think big. "You're more like him than any of them," he'd told me. His words had settled deep inside me, a profound weight of responsibility. This was about more than just saving a house now. It was about resurrecting the very principles on which my grandfather had built his life. I closed my eyes and let the scene play out in my head. Tomorrow, my father would stand at the head of that long walnut table, oozing arrogance as he pushed for the final vote to sell the estate. Ben would be right there beside him, that familiar smug smirk plastered on his face. Chloe would be ready with her arsenal of cutting, sarcastic remarks. But this time, I wouldn't be silent. This time I would stand up, open my briefcase, and show every last one of them who Mark Callahan had become. On the morning of the third and final day, the air inside the mansion felt thick and charged, like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm breaks. I woke up early and pulled on my usual light blue button-down and jeans, but today, something felt different. I wasn't the 16-year-old kid who had been thrown out of this room, or the 30-year-old man who had been ridiculed for speaking his mind. I was Mark Callahan, 35 years old, with $95 million in my corner and a purpose. I found Uncle George in the kitchen already making coffee. He handed me a mug, and I saw a confident, almost mischievous glint in his eyes. "Today's the day, Mark," he said, his voice quiet but solid as a rock. "Go in there and do what Samuel would have done." I nodded, my hand clenched around the warm ceramic. "I won't let him down, Uncle George. And I won't let you down either." He smiled and gave my shoulder a firm squeeze. "I'll be right there with you. My portfolio did well enough this year to get me to 10%. With your 41, we're about to make some history." I actually laughed. A real, genuine laugh. The first one that had escaped me since I'd arrived. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting this battle alone. We ate our breakfast in silence, but it wasn't an awkward or empty quiet. It was the focused silence of two soldiers preparing to walk onto the battlefield. I checked my briefcase one last time, making sure every document was in its place. The official company valuation report, the signed investment contracts, the confirmation letter from my lawyer. They were all there, lined up and ready like ammunition in a magazine. When I walked into the main conference room, the tension was so thick you could feel it on your skin, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. My father was already in his usual spot at the head of the table, a pristine stack of documents for the resort project arranged neatly in front of him. Ben was at his right, leaning over to whisper something to Chloe, who giggled in response. Uncle Arthur, Aunt Elizabeth, and the rest of the family were all in their seats. I sat down, placing the briefcase on my lap. It felt heavy, a solid, reassuring weight, not just the weight of the paper inside, but the weight of all the years I had fought this war in silence. My father stood and tapped his pen lightly on the table to signal the start of the meeting. "Today marks the final day of our conference," he began, his voice ringing with self-importance. "We will now hold the official, binding vote on the sale of this estate to the Riverside Development Corporation. I firmly believe this is a pivotal opportunity for the Callahan family to embrace the future, to evolve my father's legacy into a modern, more profitable enterprise." He scanned the room. "Does anyone have any final statements before we proceed to the vote?" I looked across the table at Uncle George. He gave me a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. This was my moment. I took a long, slow breath, stood up, and tightened my grip on the handle of my briefcase. "Dad," I said, my voice coming out clearer and stronger than I had expected, "I have something to say." Every head in the room swiveled in my direction. Ben raised a single eyebrow, that smug, familiar smirk already spreading across his face. "Oh, here we go," he sighed dramatically. "What is it this time, Mark? You going to lecture us about your little organic food stand again?" Chloe let out a tinkling artificial giggle, covering her mouth with a hand weighed down by diamonds. "Oh, let him talk, Ben. Maybe he's finally going to ask for a loan so he can buy a few more votes. My father crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes like two chips of granite. "Mark," he said, his voice flat and dismissive, "if you are about to launch into another one of your sentimental tirades about legacy and family values, then just sit back down. We don't have time for your theatrics." I didn't move. I held his gaze, feeling the cumulative weight of a decade's worth of pain and humiliation rise up in my chest, a cold, hard knot of resolve. "Dad," I said, my voice now ringing with a clarity and strength that surprised even me. "I'm not here to talk about sentiment. I'm here to talk about facts. And I've brought the proof." I snapped open the latches on my briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of carefully organized documents. The room went utterly silent. The only sound was the crisp rustle of paper as I laid the file on the polished surface of the table. "This," I began, my voice now echoing with power in the stunned silence, "is the official valuation report for my company, the sustainable food startup that you have all found so amusing." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across their dumbfounded faces. "It is currently valued at $250 million. My personal assets as of this morning are $95 million. And according to the rules of this conference, your rules, that gives me a 41% share of the vote." It felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Ben's jaw literally dropped, his arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. Chloe was just staring at me, blinking rapidly as if the words I'd spoken were in a language she couldn't comprehend. Uncle Arthur leaned forward in his chair, craning his neck to get a better look at the papers on the table. And my father, for the first time in my entire life, I saw him look completely and utterly lost. What are you talking about, Mark?" he stammered, his voice laced with a tremor of disbelief. I slid the thick file across the polished wood toward him. "You can look for yourself. It's all there. The report from a top-tier independent auditing firm, the signed investment contracts from some of the biggest venture capital funds in Silicon Valley, a notarized letter from my attorney." I let my gaze travel around the room, meeting each of their stunned expressions. "It's all real. I don't have 3%, I have 41. A wave of hushed, frantic whispers washed over the room. Ben just sat there, shaking his head, his voice barely audible. No way, you're lying. How could someone like you have $95 million? Someone like me?" I repeated, my voice now as hard and cold as steel. I locked my eyes on his. "You mean someone who doesn't need a flashy car or an expensive suit to feel like a man? Someone who doesn't need to come to this conference once a year to brag about his accomplishments?" I leaned forward, planting my hands on the table. "Someone like me was working day and night while you were all playing with your portfolios. Someone like me built a company from the ground up, a company that is creating something that actually matters. Sustainable food for a world that is starving for it. You can choose not to believe it, Ben, but numbers don't lie." I turned my attention back to my father. He was still holding the documents, his eyes darting back and forth between the pages and my face, a chaotic storm of anger and confusion brewing in their depths. "Dad," I said, my voice softening slightly, "I have held my tongue for years. Not because I was weak or because I had nothing to contribute, but because I was determined to let my actions speak for themselves. Well, now I have a voice, and I intend to use it." Before my father could formulate a response, Uncle George stood up, his presence commanding immediate attention. "I stand with Mark," he declared, his voice resonating through the room. He looked at each of my relatives in turn. "I hold 10% of the vote, and I am casting my lot with my nephew. Together we control 51%, enough to veto any proposal brought before this conference." The room exploded. Chloe let out a shrill cry of protest. "Uncle George, what are you doing? This is an incredible opportunity for the family." Ben slammed his fist on the table, his face turning a blotchy, furious red. "This has to be a joke. Mark, who the hell do you think you are, turning this family meeting into your own personal circus?" My father held up a hand, a silent command for order. The room quieted. He looked at me, his gaze now sharp and dangerous. "Mark, do you really think you can just waltz in here, wave a few pieces of paper around, and seize control? You may have money now," he sneered, "but you have no experience. You don't understand the first thing about how this family operates." A small, sad smile touched my lips. I had waited a lifetime for this. "Dad, I understand this family far better than you realize. More importantly, I understand what Grandpa wanted for us. He wanted a family that was united, not a boardroom where we all fight over who has the biggest bank account. And I am here to protect that vision." I took a breath. "I veto the proposal to sell this house." The whispers in the room instantly escalated into shouts. Ben leaped to his feet, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You can't do that! Dad, do something!" My father just stood there, his eyes flicking from my face to the documents in his hand and then back to my face again. And in that moment, I saw something shift in his expression. The raw anger was still there, but beneath it I saw the first flicker of resignation. He knew. He knew the papers were real. He knew he had lost, knew he had. "Mark," he said, his voice now quiet, almost hollow. "Are you sure this is what you want?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied, my gaze unwavering. "This house is Grandpa's legacy. It is not for sale." The tense silence was shattered by the sound of Uncle George clapping his hands together. "Well done, Mark," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Well done." And then the room erupted into complete and utter chaos. Chloe shoved her chair back so hard it nearly toppled over, storming out of the room while muttering under her breath about how I was single-handedly destroying the family. Ben just stood there, glaring at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred, as if I had just robbed him at gunpoint. Uncle Arthur, Aunt Elizabeth, and the others were huddled together, whispering furiously as they tried to make sense of the new reality that had just crashed down on them. But my father, he just slowly, heavily sank back into his chair. He said nothing. He just sat there, clutching my documents in his hand. My heart was still pounding, but it was a different rhythm now. It was the triumphant, soaring beat of victory, of liberation. I had done it. I had taken back my voice. I had saved my grandfather's home. After the meeting finally disintegrated, Uncle George pulled me out into the garden and wrapped me in a fierce, heartfelt hug. "You did it, Mark," he said, his eyes shining with pride. "Your grandfather is smiling down on you right now." I laughed, feeling a pressure that had been building inside me for years finally release. I knew this wasn't the end. My father, Ben, and the others would not accept this defeat gracefully. They would regroup. They would plot. They would try to find a way to wrestle back control, but this time I was ready for them. I had Uncle George by my side. I had the resources to fight back. And most importantly, I had the unshakable conviction that what I was doing was right, a conviction forged in the values my grandfather had instilled in me so long ago. Back in the quiet of my room, I opened a new email from Elizabeth. It was a confirmation that all of my documents had been officially notarized and were now legally indisputable. I walked over to the window and looked down at the garden, at the massive ancient oaks my grandfather had planted, their branches reaching toward the sky like steadfast arms. "Thank you, Grandpa," I whispered. "I did it." Even now, hours later, I could feel my heart racing, my hand pressed against my chest. But it wasn't the frantic, anxious rhythm of before. This was the pulse of freedom, the feeling of someone who had walked through hell and come out the other side, not just intact, but stronger. I had finally done what I had spent the last decade dreaming about. I had stood up to my family. I had faced down my father, Robert Callahan. I had taken back my voice. I had saved the home my grandfather had poured his life into building. But as the moonlight spilled across the floor, I knew this victory was just the beginning. The Callahan family was not an institution that forgave easily, and I had just kicked over their hornet's nest. I knew the fight was far from over. A soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. Uncle George was standing in the doorway, still in his simple button-down, his kind face lit with a proud smile. "You holding up, Mark?" he asked, stepping into the room. I'm not sure, Uncle George," I admitted, managing a weak smile of my own. "I just blew up my entire family. I have no idea what comes next." He walked over and sat down in the old wooden chair by the window, his gaze settling on the garden below. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Robert and Ben might be furious, but they can't argue with the facts. You proved to all of them today that you're not just a Callahan by name. You carry your grandfather's spirit." His words were a balm to my frayed nerves, making me feel as if a part of my grandfather was right there in the room with us. But alongside the comfort, I felt a new kind of pressure settling on my shoulders. I hadn't just stopped the sale of a house. I had completely upended the power structure my father had spent the last 2 decades building. I knew he wouldn't let that stand. The next morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was heavier than I had ever felt it. I walked into the dining room, a space that was usually echoing with loud conversation and the clinking of glasses, and was met with an almost complete silence. Chloe was huddled in a corner, staring intently at her phone, but I saw her eyes flick nervously in my direction. The usual derision now replaced with something else. Fear, maybe? Uncle Arthur and Aunt Elizabeth were whispering together, but they fell silent the instant I walked in. Ben was nowhere to be seen. He was probably off somewhere, licking his wounds and trying to process the shock of the day before. And then there was my father. He sat at his usual place at the head of the table, holding a coffee mug in both hands, his gaze as cold and hard as a winter sky. "Sit down, Mark," he said, his voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion. I pulled out a chair and sat, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on me, waiting. But I said nothing. I wanted to see what he would do next. After a long, suffocating silence, he finally spoke. "You put on quite a performance yesterday," he said, his tone carefully neutral, but I could hear the bitter resentment simmering just beneath the surface. $95 million, 41% of the vote. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "You've been keeping secrets from this family for a long time, Mark. I don't know whether I should be proud of you or furious." I met his gaze directly, keeping my own voice steady. "Dad, I wasn't keeping secrets. I was just doing my work the same way Grandpa did. I didn't do it to show off. I did it to protect what's important." My father snorted, a short, ugly sound. "Protect?" he repeated, shaking his head slowly. "What exactly do you think you're protecting? My father's legacy? Or are you just trying to prove to everyone that you're better than me?" His words were a deliberate, calculated strike, but I refused to let him see that they'd landed. "I'm not trying to prove anything to you, Dad," I replied evenly. "I'm just trying to do what I believe is right. This house is not for sale. It's the place Grandpa built for us to come together, not to tear each other to pieces over." Just then, Ben strode into the room, his entrance cutting through the tense standoff. He was wearing an expensive-looking polo shirt, but his face was flushed and his eyes were practically glowing with fury. "You think you've won, don't you, Mark?" he sneered, his voice shaking with a barely controlled rage. "You think you can just come in here, flash some documents around and run this whole family? You're still nothing. Ben, Uncle George's voice cut in sharply from the corner. That's enough. Mark just did what you've never had the courage to do. He stood up for something he believes in. If you've got a problem with that, maybe you should take a long look in the mirror. Ben wheeled on Uncle George, a nasty retort already forming on his lips, but my father held up a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. Ben, sit down, he commanded, his voice like stone. He turned his attention back to me. Mark, I am not going to debate this any further. You have 41% of the vote. With George, you have 51. You've won. He paused, his eyes narrowing. But don't for a second think this is over. I nodded slowly, holding his gaze. I understand, Dad, but I'm not backing down. Later that afternoon, I was standing in the garden, just looking up at the old oaks when my father appeared beside me. He stood there for a long moment, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon. It was the first time I had seen him in years without a suit and tie. He was just wearing a simple button-down and a pair of khaki pants. He seemed different, smaller somehow. The usual overpowering aura of authority was gone, replaced by a quiet weariness, a hint of something that almost looked like vulnerability. Mark, he began, his voice softer than I had heard it in a long time. Do you know why I really wanted to sell this place? I looked at him, waiting. For the money? I asked, unable to keep the skepticism out of my voice. He shook his head slowly. Not just for the money. I wanted this family to have a future. I wanted us to be a bigger name, not just in Arden, but nationally. My father, your grandfather, he was a brilliant man, but he always thought too small. I didn't want us to be trapped by his sentimentality, stuck in the past. I didn't respond right away, just stood there trying to process what he was saying. It was the first time I had ever heard him speak about my grandfather with anything other than a dismissive arrogance. But I also knew deep down that he had fundamentally misunderstood what a legacy truly is. Dad, I said finally, moving forward doesn't have to mean selling off the things that define us. Grandpa didn't care about being a big name. He cared about being a family, a real one. My father looked at me, and for the first time I saw his certainty waver. Then he said something that completely blindsided me. Mark, I want you to come work with me. You have the capital. You have a vision. Together we could take Callahan Lumber to a whole new level. I'll make you a senior executive. His offer left me speechless. A small part of me wanted to believe him, to see this as a genuine olive branch, a final, grudging acknowledgement of my worth. But another part of me, the part that carried the scars of his years of contempt, knew better. This wasn't an apology, it was a strategic move, a desperate attempt to bring me back under his thumb. Dad, I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, choosing my words, but I have my own company to run. I'm going to stick with that. His lips thinned into a tight, hard line. He said nothing else, just turned and walked away. I watched him go, his figure shrinking until it disappeared behind the trees, feeling a strange mixture of relief and a profound, lingering sadness. Ben, unlike my father, was not one for subtlety. That evening, as I was packing my bag to drive back to Raleigh, he appeared at my door. Mark, he said, a wide, predatory smile stretching across his face, though his eyes remained as cold as a morgue slab. Congratulations, who knew my screw-up little brother was a secret millionaire? I just looked at him, refusing to take the bait. Thanks, Ben, I said, my voice flat. Was there something you needed? He sauntered into the room and plopped down in a chair as if he owned the place. Look, Mark, he began, leaning forward conspiratorially. I don't want there to be bad blood between us. We're brothers, after all. Maybe I've been a little hard on you over the years, but now that you're successful, we could do great things together. I've got a few ventures in mind, and with your capital... Ben, I cut him off, my patience finally snapping. If you ever want to have a real conversation with me, it won't be about my money. You never gave a damn about my work, my company, or anything else about my life. Don't start pretending now." His friendly facade evaporated. He stiffened, the smile vanishing from his face. "Still holding a grudge, I see," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low snarl. "Fine, Mark. Have it your way. But don't think for a second you can control this family forever. Dad will find a way to get his power back. And when he does, I'll be right there by his side." He stood up abruptly and stormed out of the room without another word. I watched him go, a familiar wave of disappointment washing over me. A foolish, naive part of me had hoped that this might change things between us, that he might finally see me as a brother instead of just a competitor. But I should have known better. With Ben, it would always be a competition. In the midst of all the animosity from my father and brother, Uncle George was my one source of comfort. After Ben left, he found me out on the back porch, just standing there, looking out at the trees. "You did a good thing today, Mark," he said, his eyes also on the old oaks. His voice was thick with emotion. "I know what it's like to be the one who gets ignored. I've spent my whole life living in Robert's shadow. But what you did today, it gave me hope. Hope that your generation can finally set this family back on the right course." I smiled, genuinely touched by his words. "I couldn't have done it without you, Uncle George," I said. "You were the only one who ever stood by me." He shook his head. "No, Mark, you were the one who led the charge. I just followed your lead. But I truly believe that with you at the helm, this family can finally remember who we were meant to be. We can rediscover the values that my father, your grandfather, built his life on." We sat there for a long time talking about Grandpa, about the days when the Callahan family was a real family. Uncle George told me stories I had never heard before, stories about how Grandpa had quietly helped so many people, not just within our family but all over Arden, funding scholarships for kids who couldn't afford college, building the town's first public library. "That's his real legacy," Uncle George said, his eyes shining. "And you, Mark, you're the one who's carrying it on." As the conference officially drew to a close, I left the mansion feeling a strange mix of triumph and unease. I had won the battle, but I knew the family was more fractured than ever. My father, despite his surprising offer, was still the same domineering man he had always been. Ben was clearly already scheming, and Chloe and the others were still looking at me with a mixture of fear and suspicion. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them. I had finally proven my worth, not just to them, but to myself. Uncle George walked me out to my truck, my old Ford pickup still looking like a lonely stray in the long line of luxury cars. "So what's the plan now?" he asked. I turned and looked back at the mansion, at the tops of my grandfather's oaks reaching for the sky. "I want to make this place mean something again," I said. "I don't want it to just be a house. I want it to be a place that truly honors Grandpa's legacy. A place where we can help young people who are just starting out, the way I was, to build their own dreams." Uncle George nodded, a wide, proud smile spreading across his face. "Whatever you decide to do, Mark," he said, "I'm with you, all the way." I climbed into the cab and turned the key. As the old engine rumbled to life, I felt a profound sense of a new chapter beginning. I had saved the house, but I knew that the real work, the work of healing the fractures in the Callahan family and truly restoring my grandfather's legacy, had only just started. And I was ready to see it through no matter what it took.